All right, so my name is Lisa Levesque. Thank you for having me here today to talk. So my talk is entitled Material Culture Studies and Librarianship, the radical idea of taking objects seriously, but I could have subtitled it, and now for something completely different, because I'm going to talk about theory rather than really practical matters. And right off the bat, I just want to mention that these are available online with references if you're interested in checking them out. So this past summer, I conducted an independent study on material culture studies and librarianship, which informs my lightning talk today. Specifically, I'd like to talk about critical theory concerning objects in the library context. And I won't pretend that this isn't an odd topic. There are probably some of you wondering, objects? Like objects? Things? Call it what you will, I mean that which is non-human but which interacts with humanity, our stuff. To be more specific, material culture is a term that derives from anthropology, meaning the material remnants left over from a culture. For instance, an anthropologist might have some clay pots, and he or she would say, what do these mean? From studying the pots, they could then figure out cultural practices concerning cooking or olive oil production. Looking at material culture is a way to learn about the culture that created it. Contemporary material culture studies says that you can look at contemporary objects in order to learn about contemporary culture. For instance, what kind of culture created objects like these? And yes, some theorists do refer to objects as non-humans, but that always makes them seem kind of sinister to me. Like, ooh, right now we're surrounded by non-humans. But of course we are. We always are. Things give shape to our world and to our lives. There's the newspaper that you read in the morning to learn about current events, the coffee that you had this morning, or the ugly OLA vests that volunteers have to wear so they can be identified. Or the library book that you pick up to read. Of course, libraries do much, much more than just lend out books. But the collection remains the core of the library. And librarians connect patrons with information through the medium of objects, whether it's a book or an electronic file. And I'd like to point out here that just because information is stored electronically sometimes doesn't mean that we somehow avoid physical objects. So to quote Marlene Manoff, electronic objects are as dependent upon material instantiation as printed books. In other words, everything has a physical form, whether we're talking about paper and ink or a screen that's composed of glass and heavy metals. So all of these objects that I've just mentioned, newspapers, cups of coffee, books, they function as partners that work with us. Now, I don't mean partners in the same way that humans might partner off with one another. Instead, partnerships between humans and objects occur on such a regular basis that we barely register that they exist. They partner with us like tools and clothes and food do, fitting as neatly into our lives as a cup of coffee fits into a hand. So during my independent study, I came across several terms to describe this pairing of human and object. So they are our companions. We collaborate with them. When you have a human and a machine working together, we would call that a cyborg. Like the Terminator, but less frightening. So a cyborg can be anything as simple as a car and a driver, where the driver's legs are extended through the pedals and the wheels, or another example would be someone on a computer using the internet. So my favorite term is hybrid, and this comes from the work of Bruno Latour and his critical work on actor network theory. So Latour sees humans and non-humans as inextricably bound together in a network, where one actor impacts another, impacts another, impacts another, to the point that you can't really differentiate who's doing what. So for instance, if one of these blue circles is a person on a computer, the next one over is a computer, the next is the internet, the next is a computer, The next is another person on that computer. If I send you an email, that's two humans communicating, but there are an awful lot of objects that go into the equation. So that's the big overall picture of actor network theory. On a smaller level, we have individual collaborations between humans and objects that happen all the time. These are hybrids. So humans are hybrids every time that they interact with information sources. All right, so to get back to academic libraries, how would the library change if we were to take the concept of objects seriously? I can think of three ways. So focusing on objects might make it seem as though we're neglecting what's really important, which is people, our patrons, but we're actually looking at objects in order to improve the human experience of using them. So I don't think that the Mount Pleasant Branch Library, pictured here, took humans into account when these stairs to nowhere were built. Yeah, objects, yeah, so it says not an entrance. You go up there, oh, not an entrance, gonna one back down. So objects are consistently ignored and overlooked. That's just how they are. They're designed to be unobtrusive. When was the last time you specifically thought about objects? A greater focus, theoretically, on objects and a willingness to see them as partners can prevent bad design in library spaces as well as information sources. So number two, granting that objects matter means paying attention to their material specificity. Is reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in an old book, maybe a first edition, the same as reading it in a new book or on a Kindle? Yeah, I see some people shaking their heads no, right? As collections librarians know, patrons sometimes fiercely prefer different formats of a text. Librarians that have special collections that work with zines or microfiche have to know the format that they work with intimately. I would make the argument that materiality and format matter for the reading experience of the text, and therefore for what you get from the text in terms of information and knowledge. So paying attention to library materials as objects forces us to acknowledge that access to information is mitigated by physicality, a fact that has implications for collections decisions. Are you going to buy in print? Are you going to buy digital? As well as accessibility. All right, finally, reframing our interactions, the interactions that patrons have with library materials as a relationship should allow us to better understand what it is that libraries facilitate. Library resources have a meaningful impact on the lives of patrons. These are objects that do things. They are not flat or lifeless. The more that we understand that a book can change a patron's life, or online access to a database can affect academics, both the profs themselves or the course of academia, the better we can work to facilitate this. Libraries create hybrids. Patrons are no longer the same after they encounter library materials. Okay, so before I wrap up today, it's worth pointing out that there are some limitations to accepting objects as important that have no doubt already crept into your mind. Seeing objects is very, very difficult, which makes acknowledging them, even treating them as partners, sound totally absurd. We normally don't give objects a second thought, apart from the roles that they play in our lives. By all means, it's okay for us to be biased in favor of people. It's people that really matter. However, we need to acknowledge our biases so that we can compensate for them. In his book, Some We Love, Some We Hate, Some We Eat, Hal Herzog discusses people's complicated feelings about animals. He shares the story of a laboratory that has 3 types of mice. So there are the first mice that the researchers do research on, and they don't feel particularly kindly towards them. They don't care. They have to do research on them. Emotional indifference. Mice number 2 are the favorite mice. These are the pets. They give them names. They love them. Mice number 3 are the pest mice. They infest the walls, and they're killed on sight. They're treated with hate and revulsion. But the thing is, the pest mice are very likely escaped lab mice, meaning that all of the mice are the same. I know that I find it difficult to be objective about my favorite battered old copy of my favorite book. Can we characterize how emotions like these affect librarians? How about patrons? Evaluating this would be difficult, in part because we're much more comfortable analyzing how an ancient culture used clay pots than we are looking at our own use of objects. We're too close to them to believe that this is useful or necessary. And our favorite books and iPads really get in the way of that. The problem is that this keeps us from seeing objects clearly. All right, and finally, I'd like to leave you with this quotation, which I believe sums up my interest in objects in the library context. Objects don't exist without being full of people, which is why they're so fascinating to critically study. And why looking at them, odd though it may seem, is really another way to look at patrons and to try to assess how the library collection can better have an impact in their lives. Thank you.